But now we will hear from another presenter, Martha Reineke. Martha is a graduate of Earlham College and has her degrees from Vanderbilt. She is here from the University of Northern Iowa, where she served in the Department of Philosophy and World Religions. She's also president of the Colloquium on Violence and author of Intimate Domain, Desire, Trauma, Mimetic Theory. Curtis, you've got a friend here. And she actually drove all the way to be with us. Her presentation today is titled Muste, Rustin, and Two Holy Experiments.
So I wanted to thank Professor Verduin so much for inviting me. I heard about this conference from my colleague, Curtis Grunler, in the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, and I wrote to her and said, can I come to your conference? I'm working on a project. I'd like to talk to folks about it. And I never expected that the welcome was going to include giving a presentation. So I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity to engage and have a conversation with you. I hope the conversation will continue throughout the conference. So I learned as a student, what did I do with that thing?
There it is, up on top.
Yes, this is classic people my age. Where is it? Okay, I learned as a student at Earlham College that Rustin was one of the most noted figures in American Quakerism in the 20th century. Over the years, I heard more about him, but I didn't delve into his life until last fall when I did a presentation on Rustin for my local Quaker group after we watched the movie Rustin. I prepared by delving into Rustin's writings. Because his Quakerism stands out, I was surprised when I turned to the biographies. Rustin's Quakerism is almost invisible. That invisibility prompted some research questions. Where is it? How might we recover it? And for this presentation, I'm adding, can this recovery also inform and complement research on another Quaker committed to nonviolence, A.J. Muste? And by extension, also Charlie Walker, another pacifist with connections to both. And lastly, why does this recovery matter, and not only to Quakers? So I'm on a path to answering these questions, and that's what I'm going to be sharing today. So two biographies of Bayard Rustin, historian John D'Amelio's Lost Prophet and journalist Jarvis Anderson's Bayard Rustin, report similarly on key moments in Rustin's life. Each acknowledges Rustin's contributions to the Black freedom struggle, while situating Rustin and his advocacy of nonviolent direct action, and from here on I'm going to just say NVDA, at the heart of the civil rights movement. D'Amelio and Anderson remind their readers that Rustin brought a pacifist perspective to every war in his lifetime, from World War II to the Cold War, influencing and shaping anti-war responses in each era. Further, noting that Rustin also embraced internationalism long before globalization became a catchword, each biographer attests to how Rustin alerted others to ways in which nationalism exacerbates violence that NVDA seeks to end. D'Amelio and Anderson differ when assessing Rustin's marginalization within the movements to which he contributed. Anderson claims that Rustin's influence was weakened because his involvement was broad rather than deep, inclined to the peripatetic by way of personality, quote, running off here and there. Rustin stayed with no cause long enough to take on or be acknowledged for leadership. Disagreeing, D'Amelio asserts that Rustin exercised authoritative leadership lost to public memory because Rustin was openly gay. Organizations with which Rustin affiliated pushed him into the shadows, presuming that formal acknowledgement of his efforts on their behalf placed them at risk. D'Amelio introduces readers to a Rustin who wielded significantly more power and influence than Anderson acknowledges. Together, these two biographies illuminate Rustin's life, enabling readers to better appreciate his exceptional contributions to social and political change in the 20th century. Yet in crucial respects, Anderson and D'Amelio missed their mark. Each underplays the significance of Rustin's Quakerism to his work, thereby distorting readers' understanding of Rustin's contributions to the movements in which he participated. Throughout these biographies, Rustin is labeled a Gandhian organizer. When the word nonviolence is attributed to him, it is almost always modified by the adjective Gandhian. Commentary on his Quakerism is largely restricted to his early years. The biographers suggest that Rustin prioritized techniques Gandhi had tested in the modern world over biblically based teachings about nonviolence from a distant past. True, Rustin and others in the U.S. civil rights movement used methods of nonviolent engagement influenced by Gandhi. Anderson and D'Amelio tell this story well. However, when they tether Rustin's thought almost exclusively to Gandhi, D'Amelio and Anderson don't engage their sources in ways that also illuminate Rustin's Quakerism. Their few comments are imprecise or overly generalized. For example, Anderson quotes without explanation a description of Rustin as a man of fine tastes, a Quaker who wasn't as Spartan-like as his brethren. D'Amelio states that Rustin turned from Quaker to Gandhian thought because Gandhi breathed life into his values, promising their realization in this world, not just in the next. Quakerism's testimonies, which are the outworking of faith in daily life, and Quaker actions on behalf of the peaceable kingdom, which in Rustin's life still echoed Quaker's founding millennialism, are largely invisible to these biographers. And as I go on, if you're not familiar with the testimonies, the notion of testimonies or millennialism and Quakerism, that'll become clear. Recent biographical essays in the book, Bayard Rustin, A Legacy of Protest and Politics, also treat Quakerism primarily as an artifact of Rustin's early life. Therefore, all three biographies wholly neglect liberal Quakerism in Rustin's lifetime. Yet Rustin states that Quakerism played a key role in his activism. Indeed, in a letter to Joe Beam in 1986, Rustin wrote, "My activism is rooted fundamentally in my Quaker upbringing and the values that were instilled in me by my grandparents who reared me. That these values were still part of his life remains unexamined." Muste scholarship similarly highlights Gandhian features of the Quaker Muste's approach to nonviolence. Professor Danielson's significant contributions to Muste scholarship emphasize the Gandhian tenor of Muste's activism, but say relatively little about his Quakerism, even though Muste states that, notwithstanding the eventual termination of his sojourn with friends at the meeting in Providence, Rhode Island, the Society of Friends remained his real spiritual home for the rest of his life. The thread of Quakerism running through Professor Robinson's biography is also relatively slender. However, the essay Robinson wrote for Pendle Hill on Muste's relationship with the Society of Friends does augment what we know about Muste's Quakerism. In fact, as I shall shortly show, I have found in Robinson's essay a path for the recovery of Rustin's Quakerism. And so I want to express my appreciation. You've made my work much easier to do. It's a wonderful contribution. So, Rustin and Muste's Quakerism does pose a challenge to those looking for it. Quakerism has no formal doctrines, creeds, or theology overseen by ecclesiastical authorities that biographers might search for in Rustin or Muste's writings as evidence of adherence or non-adherence to tenets of Quaker faith. Further, Quaker thought is woven into their writings, which attest to a range of intellectual influences. Still, I am finding in my research that much remains to be learned of Rustin's Quaker-influenced activism. I would like to suggest that this recovery also has implications for Muste scholarship. I want to emphasize that I do not attribute the relative invisibility of Rustin and Muste's Quakerism to weaknesses in the scholarship of any of the historians I have cited. Their scholarship is robust. However, as those of us who have been beneficiary of liberal arts educations at colleges such as Hope, as we know, the academic disciplines offer multiple lenses through which to view past and current human phenomena. I'm not a historian, but I'm a scholar who draws on 20th century French social theorists and philosophers in my work. So in the remainder of this presentation, I will utilize tools from that body of scholarship to illuminate Rustin's and by extension Muste's Quakerism in a way that complements and augments the work of the historians. My goal is to illuminate Quakerism not as orthodoxy, a focus on thought, but as orthopraxis, a focus on action. And there's only one slide of theory here, folks, so you just have to bear with me. And since I'm retired, I haven't been able to teach this stuff for like 3 years, so, I love this stuff. Okay, so, all right. The concept of habitus, developed by Pierre Bourdieu, is highly suggestive for efforts to recover Rustin's Quakerism. Bourdieu describes habitus as an embodied history. It is the experiences we internalize so that they seem like second nature. A central feature of habitus is spontaneity without consciousness. Absent both mechanical necessity and deliberative choice, habitus is a practical sense that is well illustrated by the phrase, a feel for the game. With this reference to a recreational activity, I do not intend to diminish religious faith. To the contrary, the phrase enhances comprehension of and appreciation for faith as a human phenomenon. How does the metaphor of a game illuminate human experience? Well, with a new board game at hand, we review a sheet of instructions. Commencing to play, we frequently check our moves against the rules. We are challenged to understand what counts as winning and to distinguish play that signals ineptness from play that breaks a rule. All but the most basic possibilities of the game are invisible to us. With experience, we set aside instructions and demonstrate a skill-based mastery of the game. We anticipate moves, we intuitively gauge risks, press our luck, demonstrating a feel for the game not even hinted at by the instruction sheet. Caught up in our play, the game no longer is a series of deliberative choices. Describing this phenomenon, Merleau-Ponty writes that on a playing field or court, let's imagine Caitlin Clark here, an athlete feels at one with the game, seeing, thinking, and acting in accordance with the structure and form of it. Reflective awareness of strategy or convention is minimal. One just plays the game. For the non-athletes and board game avoiders among us, other examples of habitus readily come to mind. For example, the campus visit tours our children make to liberal arts colleges. Any two colleges exude a different habitus. Our children don't care for one college, but in the midst of a visit to another, they find themselves saying, "These are my people." Or I like to think of a conference with professors of religion at the American Academy of Religion, which shared the same convention center and hotel with delegates to the national meeting of the U.S. Chambers of Commerce. Hotel staff actually commented on the striking differences between the two groups. The distinct habitus of professors and that of business leaders was glaringly evident. Or compare students and faculty in a biology department with those in English language and literature. Once attuned, we see examples of habitus everywhere. Nick Crosley, a social theorist influenced by Bourdieu, suggests modifications to the theory. The concept of habitus does not account well for human agency, particularly the agency of those who engage in movements for social change. Bourdieu would have difficulty accounting for challenges to Jim Crow. How did Rustin and Martin Luther King Jr. imagine plays in a game that would transform cities across the South, result in a freer and more just habitus? Crosley focuses on the generative capacity of habitus to modify situations and to move on. Citing Merleau-Ponty, argues for the primacy of practical over reflective forms of being. Our primary relation to the world is not thought, Rather, we have a grip on the world before we come to know it. A pre-reflective sense of the environment, evidenced by that capacity to use space without expressly knowing it, establishes how embodied beings are agents in the world. Crucially, Merleau-Ponty adds the human capacity to take a point of view to the perceptual schema. We do not act from everywhere. Rather, we read situations in ways that leverage situatedness, and we do so in social groups. Discussing solidarity among people who share a point of view, Merleau-Ponty suggests that agency emerges from the point of view of a group. We achieve the capacity to reflect and become aware of how we navigate our world, reflexively noting our grip on it, because other people mirror back to us our habitus, aspects of ourselves that we live rather than see. This capacity for reflexivity, carried by the other, is the source of innovation, creativity, and social change. And I think this fits in really well with what we just heard, that the mirroring of these activist organizations inspires the creativity that enables us to move on. So who are agents of change? They are not people who make spontaneous choices out of the blue. They don't stand above history. Rather, they see in relationship with each other that some actions manifest a degree of creativity and innovation that effectively deform or transform the habitual. Habits generate actions, and actions modify and create new options. The documentary series on Muste that has been created here and is just such a fantastic thing holds significant opportunities for documenting radical habitus. And, I forgot to mention that previous slide, the difference between Crosley and the other Bourdieu is that one's just habitus and the other is radical habitus. And the definition fits exactly what you said. Okay, so for example, at one point, Brenda Badenkoff is discussing her father, Charlie Walker, who collaborated with Rustin on logistics for the 1963 March on Washington. Her comments are a textbook illustration of habitus. She states, "He and Bayard worked together. They were from the same hometown. They were both Quakers. They had an affinity for what they were doing together. Walker and Rustin had an affinity, a feel for the game born of a shared history. Sharing a point of view, when they mirrored each other, creative possibilities emerged." Muste is often described as Rustin's mentor. Mentoring is a mirroring relationship. That mentoring can be understood now as an expression of radical habitus. Creative mirroring informed their mutual work on behalf of nonviolence. Muste and Rustin also mirrored each other in this way, as did individuals who participated in the discussion groups that were so much a part of the four organizational culture. Those discussion groups were the work of the creativity of a point of view shared in a circle of folks that broke through the habitual to creative new possibilities. Gandhi's life and writings also constituted a point of view for Rustin and Muste, creating a mirror of creative possibility for social change. Gandhi's encounters with Quakers, particularly Horace Alexander, informed in creative ways Gandhi's point of view on nonviolence. So my goal with this project is to identify radical Quaker habitus in order to bring greater visibility to Rustin's embodiment of it. This will entail a back and forth between his writings, interviews, other documents, using a preliminary schema of habitus, and then going in the reverse direction. So back and forth until I feel that I have illuminated his Quakerism. I see the same potential for Muste and his Quakerism. So I'm experimenting now with possible schema, and the next two slides, they look like instructions in a game. We know that in actual lives, the words on slides are just words until they are lived, testing to a feel for the game and an esprit de corps among participants. So the first example is of the Quaker habitus, and this many Friends meetings have on their website, on their landing page, a description of their faith. And so this is from the Des Moines Friends meeting. And it features descriptions of faith since the time of George Fox, describes testimonies intended to guide action, and alludes to the power of silence. So these descriptors are what I'm taking to be what is a Quaker habitus. It is the things on this list when they are lived. So the testimonies there, there's a group of 6 of them, and they're presented in Friends meetings not as creedal statements, but in the form of questions. So you ask of yourself whether you are living in accord with the testimonies. And this description of radical habitus comes from Professor Robinson's essay on Muste's Quakerism. And I was so happy to find this list because I think it beautifully captures the components of a radical Quaker habitus. Muste reviews the spiritual condition of the early Quakers and encourages Quakers today to model their own lives on these features of Quaker life. Radical habitus is an exercise in living in the spirit of apocalyptic, which Christians in the first century lived and which early Quakers sought to embody. And so that notion was the incoming of opportunities for transformed life, the perfection of humans, and the ability of humans to live in peace and justice with each other was a present opportunity. And the Quakers thought that the same thing was happening when they emerged as part of the Radical Reformation in England. It entails living in nonconformity with the present world order, practicing pacifism, and taking joy in fellowship with others. It includes participating in a spiritual community with potential to transform the world. So I apologize for the size of the font. Okay, so I want to take my schema and look now at 2 of Rustin's early holy experiments with NVDA that attest to a radical Quaker habitus. My application of social theory complements historian scholarship by enabling us to view Rustin's work in NVDA through a different lens. I do not contest that Gandhi was the source of some techniques and even a language for NVDA, but the lens that brings habitus into focus suggests that Quaker participants in NVDA would not have offered the witness they did, responding to violence without violence, based only on tactics borrowed from Gandhi's NVDA. What ultimately flummoxed and disarmed Rustin's opponents were not Rustin's strategies, but his presence. This is clear in a story Rustin tells in particularly compelling ways when describing his 1942 arrest near Nashville, Tennessee, for attempting to integrate a bus. What astounded the people on the bus and at the police station who saw his beating and arrest was the lived expression of his faith, a faith grounded in centuries of Quaker habitus and in the community that continued to breathe life into that habitus even as it pressed its creative possibilities. Analyses attentive to habitus shed light on factors that comprise a feel for the game among NVDA participants, bringing nuance and texture to historians' accounts. Rustin's home meeting for most of his life was the 15th Street meeting in Manhattan, which is affiliated with the New York Monthly Meeting of Friends. In July 1942, he learned that members of that meeting were considering offering hospitality services to U.S. soldiers. In a letter, Rustin states that the military takes full control of a man once he enters it to build him into a fighting machine. Rustin invites the meeting to consider whether they wish to assist the government in making men into efficient soldiers. Given what he describes as Friends' peculiar world task, where can support of soldiers fit? Stating that Friends' task is to embody the peace testimony, he argues that the primary function of the religious society is to speak truth to power, a phrase that Rustin coined for all of us in this letter. Rustin speaks in his letter of the peculiar social responsibilities of Friends. So this is a technical theological term. Early Friends who used this phrase were referencing a passage in Peter, which George Fox also took up, highlighting their responsibility to show forth Christ who had called them out of darkness into light. I should read that for a second. What were the peculiar social responsibilities of Friends? Rustin concludes his letter suggesting that Friends actually support the military best when they maintain the peace testimony. He specifically advises that what would look like encouraging the meeting to expend our energies in developing a creative method of dealing nonviolently with conflict. What soldiers need most to know when they return from war is that the principles of Christ have not been forsaken. They will see that Friends have in place a pattern for a way of life that can do away with the occasion of war. A pattern for a way of life is akin to the notion of radical habitus that I have been discussing. Rustin sought opportunities to share that pattern with others in prison. Reading his correspondence, I learned he had the option of serving as a CO in the civilian public service camp, but he was in communication with other CEOs who reported both that the camps were racially segregated and that COs, that's conscientious objector, would be held in complete isolation until after the war. Some fellow COs had chosen prison and engaged in NVDA there on behalf of racial integration. Rustin came to see prison as a location in which he could experiment with the creative work to which he felt called as a pacifist. After his arrest, he was held in a detention facility in Manhattan. There he protested dining room segregation, refused to cooperate with authorities, and quickly established himself as a troublemaker. That was his goal. He did not want to stay in a minimum security facility. He felt that his creative work could best be undertaken in a maximum security prison. Shortly after he arrives at Ashland, Kentucky Federal Prison, he offers prison warden R. Hagerman an 11-point sketch of exactly the kind of creative work he has in mind. So if you look at that photo and see how young he is, those of us of a certain age are saying this is just a kid coming up with an 11-point plan to transform the prison. And not only that, he's black, right? And for those of you who are young, he's your age, guys. And he's going into a federal maximum security prison going, this is what you need to do. So what did he tell the warden? Well, he told him that official federal policy had desegregated the prisons. Segregation should happen only when it's absolutely necessary. Rustin states that the Ashland prison has both staff and prisoners who come from states where segregation is legal. So he suggests to Hagerman that efforts should be made to reduce the potential for racial conflict and thus the need to separate the races through encouraging the kind of thinking and feeling which will create a unified America. He recommends that the prison undertake education for brotherhood through a well-planned program in human rehabilitation. And he offers to teach a course that will be part of such a project. It will be titled History of America and will focus on cultural contributions to America made by minority groups. No religious, ethnic, or political group will be emphasized. Rather, the course will encourage respect for all groups. The warden does not respond well. He writes to James Bennett, director of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, pleading for Rustin to be transferred. Rustin has been leading COs in dissent and using the prison's pipe system to transmit a song about lynching, and that song was Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. Rustin is not transferred, and letters sent from him in prison attest to more creative work. He and fellow white COs ask for the integration of one cell block. That wish is granted, but Rustin is the only black man to come to the common room. He works on upgrading the prison library, oversees some music productions, and teaches a literacy class to 15 white prisoners from rural Kentucky and Tennessee who have not learned how to read. He also presses the warden to integrate other areas of the prison on behalf of brotherhood. Describing the spiritual values of integration that would eliminate feelings of inferiority among the black men, Rustin explicitly links his plan with the creativity he placed at the heart of the peace testimony in his letter to Friends 2 years previous. He writes to the warden, "I have labored long, and I hope in the Christian spirit in order to make change here. Therefore, I am sure that God will bring a creative and fearless element into this prison, so that you will see your way clear to bring about this experiment." The holy experiment, the peculiar task of Friends, was the creativity he thought he could transform the prison. Rustin reached out to Jehovah's Witnesses, who also were in prison, on behalf of his goals for integration. The warden decided that the dining hall could be integrated table by table. Rustin invited Carl Johnson, leader of the Jehovah's Witnesses, to break bread with him as followers of Jesus. Sadly, his experiment was interrupted because he was accused of sexual improprieties and placed in administrative segregation. He initiated a hunger strike. When he was released from isolation and ended his hunger strike and was near the end of his incarceration, he wrote to Davis Platt, who was considering prison for his CO assignment. Rustin reflects in this letter on whether a prison actually is a community in which NVDA can have a transformative effect. He notes how, over the time he had spent in prison, few of the COs had either entered into or remained willing to engage in NVDA. He pointed out that the stresses were both physical and psychological. Most tragic, he says, is that one or two no longer believe in that of God in every man and have begun to separate men into angels and devils. A month later, he writes to another friend that he has refused parole, believing that prison is a singular opportunity to gain the best political experience for the task we shall have at the end of the war. He states that he's learning how to organize black men when people in power have developed mechanisms of control to delude black men into forging the very chains that enslave us. When will the heart and mind revolt, he asks. And he responds, things don't happen, they are brought about. He imagines a bold, nonviolent stand based on the inexhaustible possibilities of 15 million people refusing to act as Negroes or to take our place. He reviews the techniques from prison: non-cooperation, civil disobedience, sit-down strikes, no work, fasting. These, he states, can be our only weapons. Rustin's letters attest to his efforts to share in prison a pattern for a way of life that enables people to embody a Quaker habitus, seeing that of God in each other and creating community and equality without regard for race, religion, or educational differences. His comments also attest to the crucial components of a radical Quaker habitus: the capacity for his fellow African Americans to revolt and for whites to see them as equal emerges when he and others refuse to take the place assigned to them by whites and mirror back to those who would force on them a negative consciousness with a creative new option, a common humanity. Let me see how my time is going. Excellent. Okay, so I have one other example. It's much briefer. Rustin prepared institutes that he ran on behalf of 4 at churches and on university campuses in the 1940s. Muste spoke at some of these institutes. The curricular for these institutes has been extensively analyzed by Anthony Siracusa, and that's his book there. I'm waiting on delivery of the microfilm of the documents from these institutes, so I'm relying on Syracuse's description. The institutes were intended to plan and execute NVDA campaigns. Rather than focus on technique, the institutes prioritized the creation of interracial fellowship. Rustin believed that before a group could challenge Jim Crow in a restaurant, they needed to create a brotherhood. The curricula attested both to the pattern of Quaker habitus and to its radical possibilities. Rustin drew on hymns, songs, and stories to engage participants in creative habitus that would draw on the past on behalf of a new humanity. And it's almost as if, when I'm reading this, the folks were saying, why do we have to do all this stuff? Why do we have to meet together? Why do we have to have these discussions? Just explain to us how we can go out and do a sit-in, right? Let's get to it. And I think the proof of the habitus is how he responds to that directly in writing about the curricula. He says, nonviolence is more than direct action, boycotts. It's made up of preceding steps which can be carried out in millions of ways and which have always been going on throughout the course of history. Practitioners must have no fear, tell the truth, admit their own guilt in order to behave creatively. Personal practices are recommended. Pray for at least 1/2 hour daily. Join a community, a cell or a group. Make a commitment to simplify one's life in order to focus on fellowship that would lead to engaging in authentic actions with other people rather than focusing on material things. And Rustin attached an example of Jesus' actions to each of his recommendations. Were NVDA to be approached in the Institute simply as a set of tactics, Rustin warned, would imitate the structure of U.S. politics, leaving injustices fundamentally unchanged. So I think he's saying it would work on the plane of power. If you just have the techniques of power and you grab them, then your power can be stronger. And he's saying that is not, nonviolence doesn't work that way. Nonviolence is a different tool. It stems not from tactics, those aren't first, but from a personal discipline mustered for direct transformative action. So in conclusion, I would like to share why the project on which I have embarked has significance, and not only for Quakers. An approach to Rustin and/or to Muste that uses habitus as a lens for understanding sheds light on how people are galvanized to take action on behalf of social justice. If the inclination to get involved in racial justice or anti-war action emerges from a habitus, as I suggest, how we expand the ranks of committed people begins not when they sign up for NVDA, a march, or a boycott, but when we invite them to become part of a community. Nonviolence is fundamentally not a rational strategy that we adopt, a tactic we deploy. It's a way of life that we share with others and probe for its creative potential. Because of its attention to a capacity for critical agency that is nurtured multidimensionally in community, habitus also critically interrogates the tendency to focus on heroes in the teaching of American history rather than on collective action. Young people think, I'm no Martin Luther King Jr., how can I affect social change? In that regard, Syracuse's study of nonviolent Christian thought in the decades preceding Martin Luther King Jr. and the modern civil rights movement is crucial to efforts to understand the origins and furtherance of that NVDA. Rustin didn't spring out of nowhere. Muste didn't spring out of nowhere. Thurman, Pauli Murray, and James Lawson didn't spring out of nowhere. Rather, the civil rights movement was built across multiple generations, a radical habitus constructed brick by brick in communities that unified under a common roof of prophetic Christianity. Gandhian strategies for NVDA inserted into the mix a point of view, which we now understand to be a key characteristic of radical habitus, that afforded a measure of distance for activists like Rustin and Muste. That point of view proved inspirational to the social action toward which these individuals were already inclined by the tenets of their faith. But the historical situation which they took up and the faith tradition that inspired them were not those of Hinduism or of an experience with colonial India or South Africa. For Muste and Rustin, the faith tradition that formed and fed their creative work was Quakerism in its historical configuration and 20th century embodiment. So I have, I'm not going to discuss these, but if there's several days here, and the other two things I'm working on are first, how habitus sheds light on one break between Rustin and Muste, which was after the Watts riots, Rustin turned almost exclusively to working on civil rights issues. There's long explanations of why, and away from the anti-war movement. And then secondly, I think there's a theological component that comes into focus in terms of the way what is meant by the way of the cross for Quakers and how that differs from atonement theology in evangelical Christianity, rest of Protestant Christianity. But we don't need to talk about those. Okay, so have at it, people.
All right, here's one from Tim.
Yes.
Those steps and practices seem like they could have been straight from Marcus Aurelius, for example, which shows how timeless some of those ideas are. I was fascinated by the mugshots of Rustin. Typical mugshot, the person looks scared, they look kind of empty. I mean, you see them over and over again. These were just the opposite. He was relaxed. I mean, he was totally relaxed and engaged. And here he's going to prison as he's going there with a mission. And it's almost kind of like the Apostle Paul. You can kind of imagine people reacting to Paul the same way. Get this guy out of here. He's a troublemaker, huh?
Yeah, so I think have any of you been to the Justice Museum, the new one in Montgomery, Alabama? Oh, it is, and there's the lynching memorial there also. There is a wall, it's about the size of that wall. It has about 100 mugshots of the people who were arrested for the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks is one of them, Martin Luther King Jr. is one of them, but they were all dressed in their Sunday best. So all the men are wearing suits, all the women are wearing dresses. And the thing is, I'm so glad you mentioned this because, Rustin's he was a lone person there. I stood and looked at that wall. It's still so moving to me because it shows the community. You know, this was a community, and social justice happens. Yes, it happens with the heroes. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. was there. It's important to have these models for inspiration, but there were 99 other people there too, right? So I think Siracusa it was his doctoral dissertation in history at Vanderbilt, and he just shows how we stand on the shoulders of all these generations that came before, and some of these generations, the shoulders are so big and our feet are so small by comparison. Yeah. Yes?
You know, I just learned that during the Vietnam era that there were 2 Quakers who also took their lives by self-immolation. I just didn't know that. It may have been that I was too young to understand that. And then also the concept in Buddhism as a form of radical resistance is also part of Buddhist theology. So I wanted to just know more about that because 2 were Quakers, and apparently one of them engaged in that right under Robert McNamara's office at the Pentagon, and it had a profound influence. But I wondered if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so I was not familiar with that either, but what I do want to pick up is what you said made me think of the one thing I didn't pick up from. So when you look at habitus and you're looking at the Quaker one in its general form, and then the radical, what I'm calling the radical one, which was associated with transformative possibility. And you see, well, what's particularly Quaker about that? You know, I mean, you can find this thread in Buddhism, you can find it in nonviolent movements in a variety of places. So I think there's 2 ways of looking at that. One, Quakerism was one of the earliest of the Christian denominations to understand, to give up what's called Christian exceptionalism, and to believe that when you say there's that of God in everyone, that Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists don't need to become Christian, right? Right. So there is an inclusivity. We're all working toward the same thing. On the other side of that, I think one of the things I have learned from being a scholar of religion is that when one says, oh, they're all saying the same thing, what we miss is the situatedness that creates habitus. So you could, if you're thinking of the metaphor of a game, you can say, all of us have played a game that's similar to another game, right? And you say, well, that's very much like this. And then we learn quicker, right? We learn more quickly a new game if we go, oh, especially like with card games, right? But what gives a game its life, what gives our lives a rich, rooted integrity is it's not lived above the surface. So if I had been born in Japan, I would be a Zen Buddhist. But that's because I would have been nurtured in an environment where, from my family, from the institutions in which I participated in, et cetera, that would have been my inclination, my habitus would have emerged. And I think we respect habitus and its role in our different faiths when we don't say they're all the same. They have similar, another philosopher, family resemblances from Wittgenstein. You've all seen Venn diagrams, right? So there are circles that intersect, but we also give integrity to the uniqueness of our experiences when we allow for the emergence of similar stories, but in distinct pathways. So yeah, Buddhism has it. There's nonviolence. It's not a unique Quaker thing, but it was for Rustin and for Muste, the thread of Quakerism was a deeply embedded one. Yes.
Joanne might have a comment about those self-sacrificing men.
Oh, yes.
I just happened to have moved to Baltimore the week that Norman Morrison self-immolated under McNamara's window.
Could you come up to the microphone? It's really hard to hear you from this.
Mm-hmm.
Does that microphone work?
What did I get you into? I don't know, but I'll try and get you out of it. You want me to walk with you?
I don't think they detach. They seem to be on.
Is this on or do I have to talk to you?
Oh, that one, yeah.
Is it on?
Yep.
Okay, so I just moved to Baltimore the week after Norman Morrison had self-immolated under the window of Robert McNamara. And I attended, he was a member of Stony Run Friends meeting in Baltimore. And I don't have anything really all that enlightening to say about it, except that the struggle that meeting went through in many, many meetings for worship over that next year, trying to discern what of this is Quaker, what of this might be mental illness, what do we do with this poor family? He carried his daughter with him and set her aside. She was just a small child, and set her aside just before he committed his act. So there were so many dimensions of this, and the Quakers just struggled. I suppose we still struggle with things like this. I will say that, and I'll be saying this tomorrow because I used it as an example in something I'll say tomorrow, but A.J. Muste wrote a piece on the self-immolators. There were 3 of them. There was a woman who had been a survivor of Nazi Germany and who had come here to the United States and was so distressed by what was going on in Vietnam. She thought she'd come to this wonderful country, and now this wonderful country was doing these horrendous things in Vietnam, and that was her basis for her self-immolation. And then there was a young man named Roger Laporte who performed the same kind of act in front of the United Nations. We don't know that much about where he was coming from exactly, but Muste's piece said to others who might be considering the same course of action, don't do that. Civil disobedience is the way we're going to carry ourselves forward. However, we really cannot talk about these people being abnormal in a world where most everybody seems to think it's perfectly normal to just keep dropping bombs and murdering all these people. People who think it's perfectly normal to know that we have nuclear weapons that could destroy all of civilization. So let's not put this label of abnormal on these people. So
That's really helpful. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Most of us are aware of the march in 1963 with Martin Luther King, but you're suggesting that Rustin and Charlie Walker really planned the 63 march. How did Martin Luther King relate to those two guys, and what's more of the background?
Yeah, so that's the thing that has been popularized in the movie. What I had not realized before I started working on the relationship between Rustin and Martin Luther King Jr. is that many African Americans in the South were armed. That's just the way you survived after 1877 when the federal troops left the South. And Martin Luther King Jr. had weapons in his home. He had armed guards outside. And he had been introduced to Muste when Muste had come to a lecture at the seminary. And I won't step on Leela's parade here. But what I want to, so how they met and all that stuff, I'll just skip that part. But when they went down, when Rustin went down there to Birmingham, and that's in the documentary too with James Lawson, they said, you can't do this. You know, if you're going to be interested in nonviolence, you can't have guns in your house and you can't have armed guards outside. And that was it. They were gone the next day. And then Rustin's great gift was his writing ability. And he was the major speech writer for Martin Luther King Jr. And the very first speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave, since '56, I think, Rustin had written. And so Rustin was asked at one time, what is your view toward, what does it mean to you that you wrote those speeches? And he said, I believe that what ghostwriters do is they help a person articulate what they were already going to say. And so I think that's again, it's the kind of, his writing in that community of civil rights persons, Rustin's gift was words. I mean, he had lots of gifts, but I really think the volume, there's over 1,000 published pages of his writings, not to mention all the stuff on microfilm. And he just had a knack for expression. And so he was able to help with articulating for King the spirit of what he wanted to say. Now, I just learned this from watching the new documentary on gospel. Have you all watched that? It's a 4-part series on PBS on the history of gospel. And the I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King Jr. was struggling in Detroit. He'd have these speeches, and I don't know, maybe Rustin didn't help him write that one. And it was kind of sagging. And Mahalia Jackson was there, and he started talking about a dream, and in the call and response, she was like, yes, yes. And then what the documentary says is that when he went the March on Washington, and Martin Luther King Jr. was making his speech, and people were getting restless because he had a prepared text. They were getting restless. And Mahalia Jackson was sitting really close to him, and she said, Martin, tell him about the dream. And because Detroit, when he'd done it several weeks before, it was galvanizing. And he just stopped, and he went into that. And that was, of course, as we know, one of the most significant points of oratory that we have. So that was king. The I have a dream thing there was him. Yeah. Yes.
I was thinking on the self-immolation line of thought that self-immolation can't be understood in the absence of context and history. Historically, it's happened in moments of deep crisis in a society. So it happened in Vietnam when Buddhists immolated themselves at the height of repression, right before the National Liberation Front emerged in 1959 when the French and the Vietnamese dictator just went after the folks who won at Dien Bien Phu. We saw it in Tunisia, right? At the height of crisis, political crisis in that society. We're seeing it now when the world is witnessing, the horror and hopelessness in Gaza. So, for Muste or anyone to say that you shouldn't do this, it really is an expression of desperation and the depths of crisis in history. I also wanted to respond, and by the way, I thought your remarks were fabulous and enlightening.
Thank you.
Just habitus and radical habitus, that framework is really generative. I wanted to respond to where the March on Washington came from. The first March on Washington was planned during World War II by a labor leader, A. Philip Randolph. And it was a movement to bring Black Americans to Washington to protest discrimination in the wartime industries, and also the segregation of the U.S. Army. And the threat of a protest in Washington, D.C. was so epic, and it was so successful because buses were on the ready and filled with Black people from Detroit, especially from this region, that Roosevelt compromised. He met with A. Philip Randolph, the Black labor leader, and passed Executive Order 8802, which ended discrimination in the military and discrimination in the wartime industry. So Rustin is part of the labor movement alongside of Muste and remembers the power of the March on Washington and resurrects that idea at a critical moment in the second civil rights movement in 1963. So I just wanted...
Yeah, and that reminds me, I was emphasizing his writing ability. Well, obviously, when you watch the movie Rustin, you get, they didn't have email, right? They didn't have all the things we have to organize a march. It all had to be done through, and they didn't have money for phone calls back in the day. Cost a ton of money, and they didn't have money to be calling all the time. It's just phenomenal that was put together in such a brief period of time. 250,000 people showing up without the technology we have today to get people in place. I wanted to say about self-immolation. I think what you bring to mind is if our identities are fundamentally those that we mirror each other and that we hold each other's identity, what self-immolation, what you're saying to us is that when what you are seeing in the mirror is something that can't be lived, that is basically the world's on fire, then when you are on fire, you are trying to mirror back. This is what you are doing, you all. It's so. I think the difficulty with it is that is. I think to the extent that persons sense that, they want to put up a wall against the recognition of that. And so they'll say, well, that person was mentally ill, or this, that, and the other thing. And while I think mirroring the affirmation of life and never forgetting that there is that of God in everyone is what, Muste wanted to say, that we always need to mirror back an affirmation of life. The reality is that when persons don't have a sufficient protective barrier, and thank God some people don't. I mean, if we all insulated ourselves from each other, like, no, I don't want to see that, we would be far more violent toward each other than we already are. But when someone feels so deeply that the experience, that fire about them, that they take it on themselves, that is, it's something that we should memorialize, not to glorify, but to summon our own questioning. It puts us on notice, so to speak. And unfortunately, the way the press handles this, the way people respond to it, is often that message the sacrifice, the message doesn't get through. So, well, yes.
I'm still thinking about that quote that you shared early on about that Rustin said that his activism didn't spring from being Black, but from being a Quaker. And I'm just curious the connection with the efficacy, the fact that his underpinnings, he had a religious underpinning that fueled him. And I can't help but think about how identity politics has turned race into a religious underpinning. And I'm just I wonder about the efficacy, how that changes the efficacy, or how we do social justice now. It's just interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we, each of us, are creatures of multiple habitus, right? So that those of us who have become professors have this whole professorial habitus, right? And our faith communities are a habitus. I mean, they intersect. Some of them are in tension with each other. And I think whenever Rustin said that particular quote, I don't think he meant it as a kind of exclusive thing. He was just trying to trace the particular thread of his commitment to social justice as to the community that he felt was not just the motor, but going back to that Nashville arrest, what gave him the presence to be on a bus and get pulled off it and be beaten and to respond with love. He's going, where did that come from? And that, I think that's what he meant, that part of his habitus. But I also think, and one thing that I don't think the two biographies really address this yet. I think much more work needs to be done with Rustin. And of course, it was blocked for so many years because of him being gay, and it was only recently that scholars could work on Rustin as students, grad students. And there was a day when you couldn't do that. Well, he was gay, you can't do that. His being Black was a complicated story, and people say, well, he was so comfortable around white folks, and he was always around white folks. But I think the threads I was picking up in the biographies, more needs to be done, because the second half of his life, he and King something happened when they went out to Watts and saw the destruction. And Rustin's interactions with Black Power and his, part of it was youth. It's they thought he was not taking a stand, and it's they don't, you have no idea how many times I was arrested and put in jail, right? There's this sort of a generational thing. But I think for scholars to work on his multiple identities, I'm trying to figure out, because the habitus I share is the Quaker one, but obviously I don't share the question of race and what that generation. He saw young people in Watts and saw what was happening, and that directed him in the ways he moved further away from the anti-war effort. That was just not a priority for him. And I think the habitus of being Black in that time period and seeing young people going in directions that he thought was not, and he still thought he could make transformative change. And then D'Amelio, of course, does the focus on the habitus part of what it's like to have to be openly gay in a time period when it's very dangerous to be openly gay. And so there's so many. That's why figures who tower above us often have very powerful intersecting habitus. Yeah. So.
Martha,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.